Hi, and welcome to Think About It, or welcome back. And thank you for tuning in to this episode, where we talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel The Great Gatsby, which is often considered the great American novel. It was published in 1925 and is considered the quintessential book about the Jazz Age, that time in the 1920s when America was filled both with reckless abandon after World War I and also a questioning of the American dream. Gatsby embodies that dream, and he's both a con man and also someone who seduces us. So I wanted to talk to somebody who is really an expert on the book and really loves the book, every word of it, every last word. So I turned to John Collins, who is the founding artistic director of a theater company called Elevator Repair Service. And they've put on a play called Gatz, which really encompasses every single word from the novel and runs to about 6.5 hours. It's an amazing play to watch, and you can find Elevator Repair Service at ERS Theater on Twitter or ERS Theater on Instagram to get some clips from their previous shows and find out when and where they will perform again once the pandemic is over. You can find me at uli.baer on Instagram and Twitter, and the podcast is at thinkaboutit.podcast on Instagram, and the YouTube channel is Ulrich Baer. Be sure to check us out. Thank you for listening today and enjoy this episode on The Great Gatsby. Think About It. Deep conversations with Uli Baer on big ideas and great books. Thank you, John, for joining me today. First of all, welcome to Think About It.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I'm really excited to speak to John Collins today. You're the artistic director of the theater company Elevator Repair Service, and you are one of the many, many people who love The Great Gatsby, right?
That's right. Definitely.
But your love as a theater person, your love of Gatsby led you somewhere else. It didn't lead you just to reread the book after you read it probably in high school and to identify or sort of think about these characters. And your affection for the book seemed to have taken you in a very different direction from most people who care about Daisy and really find Tom reprehensible and identify with Nick and admire Jay or something like that. So can you tell us a little bit how you started out?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I guess I have to correct the record a little bit. I did not read it in high school, and I don't know why that didn't happen, because it seems like everyone does. And in a way, that was I think that was to my advantage, because when I came to it as an adult and not as a teenager. And I think what I came to discover over my engagement with it was that, hidden inside this very easily digestible novel for high school students is a really profound and subtle and beautiful adult novel. So I think not having read it in high school helped me see that. But also my love of the book actually came about. It didn't pre-exist. It wasn't exactly why I chose to do this. It was my love of the book was something that developed over my prolonged exposure to it. I was certainly interested in it, but as someone who hadn't read it as a young person, my relationship to it, kind of came through the popular imagination of it. So I knew the movies, or I knew the Robert Redford movie, the Coppola movie, but I knew, I knew about Andy Kaufman's involvement with it. I knew about all these kind of peripheral things, and I would describe the movies as in some ways peripheral to it. So what I wanted to do when we started out was, first of all, it was my directing partner at the time, Steve Bodo, who kind of brought the idea of the book, and and he had an interest in it thematically in terms of how it related to the New York of the late '90s, which is the period of time we were in when we first got the idea. And I said, well, let's do it. And but for me, I was interested to see what would happen if we tried to put an entire novel on stage. For me, it started out as a kind of interest in the collision of forms. And I wanted to see, could you put a novel on stage without robbing it of its, of its sort of literary soul? And, I didn't want to turn it into a play. In a certain way of thinking. I didn't want to concede defeat somehow, that I was going to have to cut all this great writing out of it. I wanted to see what would happen. So it was an experiment, and it was an experiment that I was pretty sure would fail. Like, I didn't really think we could do it. I didn't, and that was okay, because in the kind of work that I do, failed experiments sometimes yield the best results. It's what you discover when you're attempting something, that seems ill-advised, and so putting a whole novel on stage seemed ill-advised. But the more we worked with it, the more it presented itself as this beautifully conceived of and executed gem of a piece of writing. And it was so, and this was the first thing that really inspired me about the book, was that it really seemed like every single word was necessary, and that it was just this, it was sort of delicately constructed to where it let you read enough in, it created enough gaps. And I know that's something that Fitzgerald himself wrestled with, was for example, how much to reveal about Gatsby himself and how soon. But he did something just utterly brilliant in the sort of spare and at the same time lyrical quality of the writing. And so that was how I learned to love it, was in realizing that, oh my God, my crazy, downtown New York theater experiment was actually revealing something amazing about the novel, because it stood up to this ridiculous idea.
But it's interesting what you're saying. You wanted to show how strong and supple and powerful the language is, and at the same time, it's actually a very short book.
Yeah.
And it's something what you said earlier, there's the kind of the mythology or the peripheral stuff. Like, we all, almost when you say Gatsby, everybody has an image, whether it's DiCaprio or Redford, doesn't even matter, or you've never seen the movie, you still have an image of a super rich guy who somehow has some melancholic part. Even if you don't know the book, Gatsby is the super rich who's not totally happy, but not totally evil. Something here, there's a story to it. But you're saying that you found the novel actually stronger in a way than even these characters who've kind of taken on their own life now.
Well, that's right. And I mean, one thing that I came to realize about the way the novel is handled in a lot of its interpretations and adaptations is it's some of what you refer to there. It's the mythology. The novel itself has a mythology that's very much like Gatsby's own mythology, and the two are almost indistinguishable. And even though there was so much that I enjoyed about Baz Luhrmann's movie, and so much that he got right, one thing I took away from it was that he seemed to buy into the same kind of mythology about Jay Gatsby that all these minor characters in the book buy into, because the obsession with the glamour and the spectacle, people interpreting the book tend to get sort of sucked into that. Whereas what the book does so brilliantly is that it leaves all of that to the speculation of other people. And that there's a truth that the book is patiently navigating toward, which is Gatsby, which is James Gatz, is not Jay Gatsby. Jay Gatsby is not real. James Gatz is real. and it's a tragic and sort of heartbreaking story about a kid who just didn't have anything, but who just was so, you know, ambitious. And in his, you know, it's so touching at the end when his father has come to collect his body, and he's reading the list of, you know, Gatz's little, you know, schedule for the day and his goals for the day, and read one improving book or magazine per week, you know, study elocution or whatever. And I got that wrong, I think, but
$5.
Poise, yeah.
Changes it to $3, and you say
right, save $5, crossed out $3. Yeah.
With your dumbbells. So this idea, I want to go back to one thing before we talk about this self-improvement, this idea that it's very American, this kind of this self-made man who's also a confidence man who also deceives everybody about his origins, and this kind of self-creation. But before that, as a theater person, you must also like the kind of make-believe and the spectacle of Gatsby, that there's a power that we want to believe. I think as a reader, we actually want to believe in Gatsby, which is interesting because he's not necessarily in a conventional way likable, but we all are invested in that myth ourselves.
Yeah.
So Fitzgerald brings you in, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so as a theater person, you also putting on, you know, you put on performances in a way, the make-believe part, the fiction part, which is, it's a novel about what people want to believe, I think. And also what Gatsby, the one thing Gatsby believes in is his love for Daisy, which at the end of the book yesterday, I reread it yesterday, and I was actually incredibly sad at the end of the book. Really, really sad. And I know I'm supposed to have all these, but I just felt just devastated that it didn't work for him.
Yeah, and it's sort of the world that gets him, because it's not even, I mean, of course he's undone by, you know, Daisy can't do it, and she rejects him, but as he's lying there on the raft in the pool at the end, he's waiting for a call, and I think he's waiting to hear from her. He still believes somehow that she's going to come to him, and somehow it's just the mess of the world around him that, you know, and Wilson's confusion that ends up causing him to die. I mean, it's heartbreaking. It's completely heartbreaking. And, you know, I do think, you know, one of the first things that Nick tells us is that Gatsby turned out all right in the end. And that, you know, we track at least I track my own feelings about him sort of through Nick. I mean, that's sort of the sort of mechanics of it, right? I mean, he's the one we have to listen to, and he gets frustrated with Gatsby, he gets angry with him, he get, you know, but then in the end, he just feels such deep sympathy for him, and I think it's through Nick we understand that he's not a bad guy, and that underneath all these things that fall away is somebody who just loves another person so much that, you know, they're willing to do anything.
And Nick's position when you set this up as your production of Gatz, where you ultimately you just did something really simple. You just put the whole thing on stage. You didn't even have to think about what character to privilege or what position to take.
Right.
But Nick's his guide, he guides us into this world, and there seems to be a constant bemused, sort of detached position. He's kind of both part of it and he's not quite part of it. There's this famous quote, "I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life," in some key moment. But he's also bringing us so close to it that we then have a choice to be fascinated or repelled. I always feel he doesn't even really tell you. He sort of goes back and forth. And
right. I mean, it's almost frustrating sometimes that and I think even Nick's professed detachment can almost ring a little hollow sometimes. I mean, it's a little bit, you know, he's he gives himself too much credit sometimes for being disinterested and not involved, because he's really like right in the middle of everything. He's a conduit for the different schemes, and he gets the truth from Jordan. And but right, I think that helped guide our choice in a way, in an intuitive way, to be, to try to emulate Nick by being detached. Like our production does not indulge that imagery in the way that a lot of adaptations do, and it's that temptation I was talking about to just bathe yourself in all that 1920s period glamour. But I think that part of the reason that our choice worked and could sustain a reading of the whole novel is because we did something that was also removed. We let those words be what they kind of wanted to be, which is Nick's words don't want to have an absolute position right away. They don't want to be he sort of sticks one toe in, and then and it's he's dispassionate in a way, and he wants to be objective. So in that sense, like, I think, and listen, I don't want to claim too much credit, because I think a lot of the decisions that we made and the good choices that we made, we sort of stumbled into happily they weren't all sort of geniusly preconceived by any means. But I think the reason that we found that our approach worked is because we shared some of Nick's detachment and skepticism about the mythology of Jay Gatsby.
But it's nice that you're saying you experimented. I mean, as people know, Fitzgerald himself rewrote this many times. Maxwell Perkins was essential. This is one of the most famous triumphs of editing. Every editor I know likes the Gatsby because the editor has such a strong hand in it. We know the draft. You can actually see the drafts. Princeton University put some of the drafts online.
Oh yeah, I've seen them. We've seen the real. We've been to Princeton and we've seen the handwritten manuscripts. It's amazing.
And he keeps on editing and taking things out. And what you're saying about that Gatsby, what you said a little earlier, and how Nick kind of falls for Gatsby, but just catches himself at that moment. And I think one of the reasons why the book resonates so strongly now, and there's also a really funny story, a strange story. In 1939, Modern Library dropped The Great Gatsby from its list because it wasn't selling. And it became a seller again in World War II when it was given as a cheap copy to soldiers.
It's amazing.
This resonance that we want to believe in this idea of America, of the self-made man who can actually completely transcend his own background and become something that everybody finds something in. Because Gatsby is also a minor celebrity. He's just on the cusp of being a household name in New York at that moment.
Yep.
But I think, Nick, I found something slightly unlikable in his resistance to himself. But he never lets himself totally go. And but the other part is, everybody who lets himself go in that book ends up either in a disaster or as a horrible, morally bankrupt person or dead. The Buchanans, they walk out of it, in their entourage. Gatsby's in the pool. Jordan Baker is a lying person who is somehow, hurt by him for a moment. But Nick gets out of it. And I think this getting out of it is sort of, Fitzgerald makes you pay a high price for resisting the myth of this American idea.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's almost a little bit of sort of Midwestern self-righteousness in that Nick, and of course it is also, I mean, I say that with, having a great affection for the last chapter of the novel. It's my favorite part, where and it's the most beautiful part, where he talks about going home and what he sees out the window of the trains, and, and his decision to just leave New York and all of that behind. I mean, he's a bit of a snob about it. And it's true that he doesn't I mean, this was the biggest issue I had with the Baz Luhrmann movie, is that in order to accommodate a device of a voiceover from Nick, I guess he changed a critical detail about Nick, which is that he made him an alcoholic. He made him a recovering alcoholic, writing about his experiences. And that is just such a profound misunderstanding of Nick, because, Nick says, I've been drunk just twice in my life. And the second time, and I guess the last time, was that afternoon at Tom and Myrtle's apartment. And so he's really, he's sort of abstemious to a fault in some ways, but it does keep the novel moving in an interesting way.
And I think this abstemious quality that he's a teetotaler in a way, or he doesn't drink, as you're saying. And Baz Luhrmann said he's a recovering alcoholic. So I think Baz, why do you think he made that choice? It's an odd choice because it gives Nick a kind of pathos also.
Yeah.
Which I think he stays on this level of a little bit of as you said, a little bit of a snob. He's a little bit better than these people. He always wants to say, I'm better than these people, although I'm poor, I don't have anything, they have all this, they have glamour, they have love, but I have my integrity.
Yeah, right. It's true. It does give, I guess maybe he could be forgiven, Baz Luhrmann could be forgiving Nick, like you said, a little bit more of a soulful, tragic presence in the thing, for having succumbed. And yet it's so much this sort of strange Nick's kind of ability to float above, and as soon as he feels a little dragged down into it, like he kind of breaks up with, in a way he breaks up with Jordan because he needs to sort of stay above it a little bit, or he's so concerned with Gatsby, and so it is sort of a hard thing to deal with in the novel if you think about it. I would love to hear. It's one of the things that I think our actor Scott Shepherd handled so beautifully, and it's because it came very naturally to him. This ability to kind of just float above just a little bit, and it's frustrating about Nick. You're right. And maybe there is something more gratifying about him getting sucked down into it and becoming a sloppy drunk.
Well, but it's kind of genius. You're the actor in your production of Gatz, Scott Shepherd. Because he's reading the book, and he starts reading it almost by accident because he finds it on this desk. He falls into a story, and he's also part of the story, as you said. Nick is totally in the middle of it. He's participating. He's Daisy's second cousin. He makes the meeting between Jay and Daisy happen. He does go to the parties. Ultimately, he likes the parties. He's there during the tragic afternoon, the plaza. But somehow in your play, he falls into the story, and somehow it seemed like he was physically, your actor was continually sort of lapsing into the story, but also not quite part of it. And there's something
right. Well, we decided we would create a kind of parallel self-discovery in a way that if Scott was not Nick at the beginning, but just some anonymous guy who's picked up the novel and is sort of getting drawn into it, then by the end he is Nick, and that I think imagined could parallel Nick's own self-discovery. Like he realizes some things about himself, some things that he seems to think he knows in the beginning when he's reflecting at the beginning about his own personality and how he dealt with certain types of people when he was in college. But then by the end, what his understanding of himself seems a more profound and deeper and more real. And for Scott to have the opportunity to hold off, to let the book itself be a kind of, let the book itself kind of interfere almost with Scott doing a thing that most actors, you expect them to do the moment they walk on stage. They have fully become their character. and you can take them for granted as their character. But it's a thing that I always love about the theater is watching people become their characters. And I think it's a special aspect of this medium where you're sitting in the room and you know that guy's an actor. You know, it's a stage. This is a seat in a theater, and that's a curtain and a brick wall. And, you know, it's not whatever they're pretending it is. But the beauty of things in the theater is that you see them become real. And so Scott gets to become Nick, just as Nick gets to become Nick.
And I think what you're teasing out is, I think the strength of this book, and people give it all sorts of names, a work of genius, etc. I think what Fitzgerald gives you through Nick is that the reader goes through some kind of experience, because you are ultimately forced, because Nick always goes to the edge of every scene and then kind of pulls back a little bit. So you will take a position, and by the end of the book, you have a position with regard to Gatsby, to Daisy, to Tom, even to Jordan, and to Myrtle. Definitely you have, and that the reader undergoes an experience. If the reader changes, I think the book is very powerful. I think it's not that Gatsby is so powerful in all this, but that every reader walks away from the book and not has a different position. I never liked this kind of idea that the book means anything. The book actually doesn't give you that many choices. I don't think there's a great choice that you could like Tom and Daisy that much at the end.
No.
Right?
I mean, at best you could have a little bit of sympathy for Daisy, but then you're disappointed with her. You have to be disappointed with her. You know.
Well, disappointed, if you think about the car accident in Myrtle, it's maybe more than disappointed.
Right.
You know, they smash people and things and walk away. And there's I think that part of that the price for this life is actually that they pay, that other people pay the price for this life. That Tom destroys Myrtle in a way, Daisy destroys Myrtle in a real way. They just use people. So I think what you said about your actor Scott, which is nice that his name is Scott.
That's right.
I think Fitzgerald's daughter was named Scotty, so there's a kind of strange.
It's all the Scots.
Exactly, and there's a kind of academic discussion about Nick's origin, sort of like they're Scottish, but they're really waspy. He really wants to make himself into the most sort of mainstream white American as he can. He's something like that, but. That the reader goes through an experience. I think that makes the book so powerful, that you're not left detached, and it's not just the glamour, and it's not just the excitement of it, but the other part is that probably all of us want to be seduced by some fantasy.
Yeah.
If we can go to Gatsby a little bit, you know, he has the money, he has all of this, but we ultimately find out pretty quickly he has this big old mansion to impress one woman.
Yeah.
I always like this, that actually that Fitzgerald pulls away the whole idea. People want to make money. They want to make money. They want to make money. It's like Orson Welles or something in, you know, like the Sled. There's Citizen Kane. There's something else they want.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting about Gatsby too. I mean, because he does seem. Because Fitzgerald plants a lot of the seeds of that character. And I guess what he means for us to see in that description of the young Jay Gatsby, or James Gatz, is that he has the capacity for dreaming really big that way. And that Daisy comes along and becomes the object for him. But it's really interesting. I mean, I feel like there's more to know about who that person is that builds that house. Because on the one hand, you know, yes, it's all about his just this intense love that he has, but he wants us to know a little bit more about him than just that fact. You know, otherwise we wouldn't have all this background, you know, which, you know, Perkins very wisely counseled him to save until chapter 6 or you know, or I guess did Perkins make him move it up or make it later? I can't remember now. I think maybe Perkins had him move it earlier.
Oh, I don't know where he made a movement. And I know that Edith Wharton wrote to Fitzgerald and said, you have to give us even more backstory to Gatsby
Yeah.
to make more real to us. But you're saying he gives us more than just he's motivated by this lost love.
Right. Well, but he, and now I'm trying to piece together all those details, the Dan Cody story,
Mm-hmm.
And how he has this revelation when he looks up at that yacht, that's one of it's right around some of my favorite errors in the book when he talks about being a clam digger and a salmon fisher on the Great Lakes where those things don't exist. but he looks up at that yacht and in that moment he invents Jay Gatsby. So he invents Jay Gatsby before there's Daisy, which is an interesting little wrinkle in the sort of in the narrative of that sort of simple understanding of, well, this is all about a guy who is just so madly in love that he will do all of this, that he will remake himself for this woman. That's I find that interesting. And it's again, it's something that's so, I think, beautifully complicated about chapter 9 is how we learn about that this was sort of deeply embedded in this person, this desire for improvement.
When he has this flash and realizes he could be Jay Gatsby, which is not somebody else, but for him, he could be himself, which is this very American idea, but any idea really that it's not that I'm going to become some artificial version, some simulacrum.
Right.
I'm going to become myself.
It will be real. Yeah.
It will be real. And this reality will not only take over myself, but everybody else and everybody. And even if people discover and find out certain gaps, and I think a lot of the book, Tom Buchanan's rage at somebody coming into a social circle and continually trying to call out, he didn't really go to Oxford, he didn't really do this, he really didn't do this, he's a fake, he's an imposter, he's a pretender. And that's where Nick is very much on the side of Buchanan. And Nick is also a total snob and said, if you didn't really go to Yale, you should not say you went to Yale. If you didn't really go to Oxford, you shouldn't say any of this.
Right.
So there's this kind of, I think, this edge in American culture between people can belong. You can remake yourself, and then you are who you are. And it's not who you're really this person who came from somewhere. And this is, of course, this is a 1920 story. Immigration is in the background. Buchanan's rage about the great replacement of the white race there. But there's a lot of this fear that Americans are totally self-invented. And then East Coast pseudo-aristocrats believe they've been there for longer than anybody else.
Right. Although it's so interesting, though, because the ultimately the novel's perspective is that it, well, at least you could argue that the perspective is that reinvention doesn't work. Is that it fails. I mean, it fails terribly for Gatsby, and with Nick, it's not so much of a failure as a realization that, you know what, I am still that guy from the Midwest. I'm going back there. He has like a much milder case of, he comes back from the war and he's restless, and he needs to get out of the Midwest and he goes to New York. But his experience sort of sends him back to where he came from, and it's a little bit of the same thing with Gatsby. He gets his death is ugly.
I wonder when you think when Nick goes back. So Nick sort of has this whole experience like us, and then he goes back. But I think Fitzgerald is pretty clear. There is no going back to Innocence, and there's no going back to believing Tom Buchanan or Daisy are innocent at all. This idea of the little sweet towns and the little Christmas wreath casting their shadows on the snow and these little small villages. Like, this is not somehow I don't think Gatsby gives you that as that's the heartland and the reality of America, and we can return after this glamorous party season.
Right. No, he's lost his innocence for sure.
Yeah.
And that, and again, I think that's something that's just it's delivered so beautifully. I mean, I think I am just so personally so seduced by the language in chapter 9 and the sort of sweeping metaphor of the as problematic as it is, of the discovery of the new world, and
Can I give you this quote for a second here? It's really, I think the third to last paragraph, I think it's actually much more powerful than even the last sentence, which everybody quotes all the time. So it's most of the big shore places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy moving glow of the ferry road across the sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder.
It's the best.
It's incredible, and it's because it is the American dream, capitalized A, capitalized D, that has all of the dark underside of the fantasy of first arrival, that there are no indigenous people, that this is own land,
right. This is unspoiled land that we can now make something out of,
But I think where Fitzgerald gives you something, it's unspoiled land, but of course, like Whitman, like these writers, he gives you, this is a canvas or a stage or whatever metaphor you want to use. This is for the imagination to test itself and to match its unlimited dimensions with the space given to us here. And he says the last time in history. He said now, because everybody after that, I think when he says this is the last time in history, everybody is historical. Nick loses his innocence. He is situated in America, 1920s, 20th century. There are all these conflicts. You just negotiate. You're sort of doing business. Until then, people were imagining a world, which is a very different thing than just setting up a big business.
Yeah. And it's funny that I'm really struck by the for the last time in history phrase. And it just, as you read it just then, I thought, well, maybe there's something that is a kind of mourning the loss of innocence in a way, like that Nick can't look at things the same way anymore. He can't, this is all the story of his coming of age. I mean, it's as much of a cliche as that is about, a protagonist's journey. That he spins this gigantic metaphor to basically reflect on his own loss of innocence there. And
but this metaphor, which you pointed out, it's so powerful because it connects him to this entire idea of America as a fiction or a fantasy or a dream.
Yeah.
A dream that's very problematic. But I think Fitzgerald wants to hang on. He doesn't want to give you innocence that's kind of total disillusionment.
Right.
Nick goes back and Gatsby is dead, but it's not that we are walking away thinking these people are horrible, transactional people, and there is no, because that's why I was so sad at the end of the book, because I thought, but his love for Daisy was real. Although it was probably not real.
Yeah, well, I mean, but that it couldn't find a home in the real world, as real as it was. And by the end there, I'm remembering the last scene with Tom too, that there is some of that loss of innocence we understand about Nick because of the way he talks about Tom. He's almost a little bit forgiving. I couldn't like him. But I could see, or I think he said I couldn't like him or forgive him, but I could see that what he had done was for him entirely, what's the next word? Justified.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say they were careless people, but he slips a little bit in his detachment and then he manages to achieve it again.
Right. Right.
to sort of even be able to understand Tom in some way. And but what I was thinking though, when the thing about the lying on the beach and thinking about the dark trees and everything, it's like one thing that's so interesting about that is the way the way he humbles himself. Like he's kind of making himself, I mean, at the same time as it does reflect his own feelings about his own loss of innocence. That way he's so humble. He makes himself so small and insignificant, and thinks about the magnitude of the continent. And in doing so, he becomes so tiny. It's something that really does. And you feel that too, as a reader. He alludes to something so large, and then equates it basically with the capacity of your imagination.
And I think that's really right when you're saying he kind of humbles himself. He's totally awed by the fact that there's something much greater and ahistorical, out of history. So it's not a historical negotiation. They arrive and they see the capacity for humanity. That's all. They see something way beyond what even historical negotiations would be. But this humbling it, he's so small on the beach there when the house is starting to already be closed up. I think that allows Fitzgerald to not totally destroy the dream and say all of this is fake, all of this is devastating and brutal and violent. He's saying there is this capacity. We all
sure. Because he connects it immediately. Like one of the next sentences is that, and as I sat there, brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light. So he draws a line. He makes this enormous, profound metaphor around the discovery of the new world, and then he draws a line straight to Gatsby looking at that green light.
And what does that give you? What is the two questions? What is the looking for the green light, which every high school student I can tell you, because I have high school students at home who I asked two, and I asked my daughter's friend last night, what did you remember Gatsby? She said, that light, the green light. So what do you make of the green light, the longing that, because it starts the novel out, that the first meeting we have with Gatsby, he stands there and he's looking over the water.
Well, it's interesting that was a detail that came a little bit later in the writing of the novel. I think that was not there. I'm pretty sure when we read that early draft at Princeton, there's no reference to a green light, and it was like he needed to. It was almost like Fitzgerald was composing the story and thinking about the themes, but he needed to actually distill it into this tiny singular symbol, it's these two little hooks that he kind of hangs the whole novel on. It's like this, not knowing anything about Gatsby at all, except that he's reaching out to that green light, and then at the end, summarizing something huge and analogizing it to the green light. I mean, that was a thing we struggled with. In our production, you only briefly see a little tiny green light when the lights go out one time. It's what's interesting about it as a thing across the water like that, and something about the way a tiny light looks is that it feels very, very far away. And I think that there was something about that particular choice. I mean, there's a lot of talk about Daisy's appearance or the effect that she has in person and her voice. These things are all, proximate. They're reachable, they're touchable, but the light is always far away. And it seems like that's really the what that has to mean ultimately is that, and it's connected to the, borne back ceaselessly into the past, boats against the current, like this, it's more about the distance between you and that thing you want than it is even about achieving it.
But the distance, it's so nothing. It's in Long Island Sound, this kind of barnyard,
right.
The wet barnyard or something in the beginning.
Right.
And we said
across a courtesy bay.
his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him. And I thought, I don't know, I thought this meant he loved Daisy back in the Midwest in St. Louis. That's when he loved her. That's when she loved him for a moment. And he wanted to go back to the past. And of course, the obvious kind of truism or kind of banal statement is say you cannot go back to the past. But he said, no, you can if both people believe it.
Right. You can't repeat the past. Why, of course you can.
But that ties into Daisy could have just said yes, and they would have relived this past. And in some ways, I think there's something Fitzgerald is not saying in a dumb way, you can't relive the past because time is chronological. He has no interest in that. He said, time is, if you fill this past with no meaning, then that past is alive to you. But Nick is sort of, that's why at the end Nick says, well, the past was behind him. He did not know it was already behind him. Well, it only became behind him when Daisy said no.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like it was, it could have opened up again. That past could have been, he really wanted to undo 5 years of his life, and Daisy could have contributed to that.
Right. And it was that, and what was in the past was the illusion of Jay Gatsby sort of intact. She was, as soon as they were separated by the war, and she needed something that he couldn't give her just because he wasn't there.
Yeah.
Like at that moment, it was over. And, he manages to briefly talk her back into it, but really it is over as the war separates them. And, she wasn't patient. She had to go with Tom because he was there and he gave her something she needed.
Yeah, and then is that part still a 1920s kind of novel of manners? Because I read a lot of Edith Wharton, The Age of Innocence or House of Mirth, which is quite beautiful and very different. I always feel like Edith Wharton, not to downplay this at all, it's like she gives you an entire novel about one of the people who attend the parties.
Yeah.
And I was really interested in this list of names, of these random names, and Fitzgerald is kind of saying, look, everybody's life is right there in front of us. I grabbed this one right here to show you something. I couldn't given any of these characters at this party because there's so many names. And the ones who got divorced, this one threw himself in front of the subway, this one went bankrupt, there's a novel in each one of them. But here with Daisy, there seems to be, I was left, I'm thinking not just Daisy had to make a choice, she needed something, but Tom wasn't a good choice.
Right.
So you sort of left thinking Gatsby was devastated by this woman, but she could have done something different.
Yeah. And, it's tough because I think there's a lot of legitimate criticism about how much of Daisy we just aren't allowed to know or understand. I mean, the best insight we get is from Jordan in chapter 4, that she was sort of a happy and popular person, and that something, and we learn about how she goes ahead with her marriage, even though she's, trying to throw away the pearls and, on her wedding day. But we don't, right. There's a very complicated story there of why she doesn't say yes and what we're meant to take from that, because it's not the same as Tom. Tom is, I'm not even sure we're meant to think it's fair to put them in the same category because Daisy really struggles and Tom just rages, and then wins. Daisy is tragic in a way because we know that on some level, maybe she never wanted to marry Tom, but she just feels resigned ultimately. And she's terrified, she's so spooked by what she learns about Gatsby in Plaza that's when she when she loses her nerve. But there's so much, it does leave you wanting to understand her a little better, as you say, because we're sort of, there's some breadcrumbs left for us there to follow, but and we end up, I think, just being left with the impression that she's weak. You know?
And what I find remarkable is that that the women in this book leave you really sort of with a pause. There's Myrtle, and I think Catherine, the sister, says they're both unhappy in their marriage. She says about Tom Buchanan is unhappy. So you suddenly think, oh, so he's unhappy with Daisy, and Myrtle is unhappy with her husband. So it's not as simple as Daisy married for money and Tom is a brute who likes the pretty girl. That I think is Fitzgerald gives you this idea and very clearly sketches this out really quickly. What are women's choices at that time? These are the choices. This is men's choices. Everybody will be responsible for their choices. And I think you're right. We leave Daisy thinking it was not easy for her. Can you?
Right, and yet she disappears.
She disappears, but she also has to disappear after the accident.
Right.
It seems to me. To me, it seems to be something they just escape, and Gatsby takes the bullet ultimately because they just live their life. It's just cleaned up, the whole thing, and it's resolved, and Tom's mistress is gone, so now they somehow benefit from this tragedy. Can you? I want to switch for 1 second, and I know you've talked about this before in other settings. There's this kind of very famous opening scene, which has been discussed a lot, where Buchanan quotes this Goddard, this kind of racial supremacy book about great replacement theory. And when you put it on stage, you've said this before somewhere else, I've seen you do this in a talk, you actually have to use all those words. You cannot distance yourself like an academic and say, oh, we're going to point at the problematic racist ideology coming out of Tom Buchanan.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not, obviously, in some ways that, because Fitzgerald, sort of brackets that or lets it come from the mouth of a character you're not meant to like, So in some ways, the stuff that comes from Tom was made a little bit easier for us because at least this is the villain saying this. There's, it's definitely, it's tricky terrain because even the things that to take the novel and not try to clean it up at all, but let it exist on stage just as it is, puts you in proximity to some of those attitudes of that time, even Nick's, even Fitzgerald's, that it's a little easier to separate yourself from it when you read it on the page, something about words on the page that have a little bit more of a kind of connection to their age. But when you say something out loud on stage, it exists in that moment. It becomes utterly contemporary because you make it so. And of course, that's the power of the medium, but it does make it dangerous in a way to, I think of the way that, Nick's, I thought it's in chapter 4. His description of seeing the limousine with the white driver and the black passengers, and some of that language is problematic, we know why, because there's a certain enlightenment that Fitzgerald had not achieved, and that most people hadn't at that time, and the descriptions of Meyer Wolfsheim as well, like they are racialized in a way that that we don't accept now, and yet,
I think this one scene which you just referred to, they're going over the Queensboro Bridge, they're driving into the city, Gatsby and Nick. It's Gatsby and Nick driving.
Yeah.
And they're being passed by a car with a white chauffeur and 3 African Americans in the car, 2 men and a woman. Yeah. And they pass them. And I think what you're saying is right. The language is still really offensive. It was offensive then to all African Americans. It's offensive today to everybody. It seems like people have discovered this now. Fitzgerald knew these terms he's using are offensive, but in a kind of deeply, I think, powerful, ironic way, Fitzgerald is also giving you a scene that's very visual, very cinematic, where this car is passing Gatsby. They're faster, they're hipper, they're modish, cooler. They are the future. And in some ways, I think Fitzgerald gives you that not, and you have to say, oh, we have to excise this because he's still stuck in some mode. He's saying America is hemmed in by its own fantasies of who belongs and who doesn't belong, and they're self-created. The whole book is about that everybody who belongs, who doesn't belong, which is racial, gender, ethnic, religious, etc. Wolfsheim, who sort of belongs and doesn't belong, who's the backbone of Gatsby's business, but no one's supposed to really know this. So I think the book is actually totally opens that up and said, well, there are going to be divisions and fault lines that will be shuffled in America. And I think Fitzgerald, by putting that quote in the first chapter where he says, white people, we have to look out, we will be replaced by Tom Buchanan. This is the background of this book. This is the discussion, and it's not that, Fitzgerald was like many other people, like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, or like other people had these fantasies on fears, that this is America's greatest problem in a funny way. That Buchanan, who kind of runs America, because he's the richest guy in the book, right? And
and he's not someone he's not self-made. He's not, and I think, maybe it's an interesting, maybe it's something else of the time that isn't just, well, they were unenlightened, but in a certain way, there was a kind of glimpse of enlightenment that maybe was being felt in the 1920s, just in that sort of exuberance. And maybe that's, I don't want to give anybody too much credit, but I think that, what's being described about that drive into New York and as they cross the Queensboro Bridge is about possibility. I mean, I realize that's a Joe Biden thing, right? It's like in America, if you could sum it up in one word, it's possibilities, and that's really what Fitzgerald is communicating in that moment by saying, hey, look, anything's possible. White chauffeur, black passengers in a limousine, anything's possible. I mean, it feels crude now, but that's really, it's almost a kind of like aspirational enlightenment, if not enlightenment,
I think the one, so Toni Morrison has this essay, Playing in the Dark, quite famously, where she looks at Hemingway and Edgar Allan Poe, and she says there's a construction, this is reducing a stereotype construction of African American presence to allow white authors to invent America. That's kind of the thesis of the book. Fitzgerald does exactly that. She says all white American authors need these kind of stereotyped silhouettes of blackness around them. But Fitzgerald says, yeah, that's what we're discussing. By putting that in the first paragraph, in the first chapter, and then putting it in the bridge moment, he says, yeah, I actually put these characters in here to create an outside to this identity, which is, as we know, it's blown up, it's exploding in front of our eyes. It's horrible human suffering in the middle of it, fakeness, make-believe, questionable origins, who belongs, who doesn't, it's all in there. And here's the outside. And Morrison, which I always liked, she actually gave those lectures when I was in college, and she said, and what we should do is read these books because they are the construction of a fantasy. And and I think what Fitzgerald is doing, the fantasy, he's not saying it's a fantasy, therefore incorrect, therefore wrong. He's saying it's very powerful and seductive.
Yeah, and it tracks through. You've got in chapter 1. Have you read this book, The Rise of the Colored Empires, by this man Goddard? We have to watch out, or the white race will be utterly utterly submerged. And that's chapter 1. And then in chapter 4, you have the scene on the bridge. And then in chapter 7, when Tom has really lost his mind and is, next thing they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between black and white. Like Tom sort of bookends the whole arc of the narrative in this fear. And Nick punctuates it right in the middle with looking at it as something hopeful. I mean, it's interesting. Like there is a thread.
It's striking. You're right. Tom Buchanan comes out with a statement. You're thinking, wait, this is your great fear in the middle of your whole marriage exploding.
Right.
interracial marriage is which is the fear. And there's another moment, I think, when Daisy and Nick are talking, have a kind of little tete-a-tete, and then Tom says, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Oh, the white race."
Yeah.
Race.
Right.
Like,
Right.
she actually totally mocks him and says, "Your little obsession here," but it's not mockery, as you're saying. It's the kind of theme that runs through the book.
Yeah. We have to beat them down, she says at another point. Right.
Right.
It keeps coming up. Right. It's interesting. It's like it's how, I mean, it almost gives you some sympathy for that that theory, which I know is pretty fringy, that Gatsby is black. You know, I mean, I haven't really read too much about that, but I know it exists. That there's at least a scholar or two who's convinced that that's what Fitzgerald wants us to believe. You know?
Well, and there's I can tell you a lot of academic papers who talk about the name Gatz, and is it Katz, and is it Jewish, and how it's sort of this whole investigation of anti-Semitism at that moment. So
Right.
It's just kind of funny that we're all participating in the same game. Like, he's not really, and the problem I have with these kind of essays, which are really informative and important, aren't we doing the same thing they're all doing to Gatsby? He said, you're not, because if we discovered he was really black or really Jewish, he wouldn't really be who he is. But what Fitzgerald is saying, well, no one is quite really who he is. We are all these products of fantasy in some ways. I mean,
right.
You know, you're a Yale man, John, right? Like, I can say that we can kind of, like, this idea, this was a really powerful idea in America, right? That actually you were made into who you are, and it stamped your identity forever.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. It's true, though. It's like it's I mean, it's a testament to sort of the power of the novel's sort of narrative energy, that we keep getting sucked into doing what those characters at the party do all the time. You know.
Yeah, we behave like these totally obnoxious, irresponsible party goers. We want to have fun at Gatsby's house. We want to smash a few crystals. We want to jump in the pool. Right. And we want to just leave it all behind and never remember him.
Right.
Yes.
And yet still, have our own expert opinions on just who he is anyway.
Exactly. Do you have a favorite character in the book of all of them?
You mean like a favorite minor character? Or any of the characters?
Any of the characters, really.
Oh gosh.
Like, who would you want at your dinner party?
And her, I think Nick is unfair to her in a way. Like he's so fixated on her dishonesty, and yet, there's greater dishonesty across the whole, cast of characters that I think he ought to be a little more forgiving of her. I don't know. I am charmed by Jordan, I think.
No, I like her a lot too, and it's funny, the academic discussion about her in the 50s and 60s, she's always called a homosexual, potentially a homosexual, which is really hilarious in a way, because they say she's potentially, because I think all these male critics, first of all, can't believe she doesn't fall for Nick totally. Yeah. And there's something in her that she's an athlete and they can't quite grasp her at all.
Right. She's too masculine somehow for them, because she's because of that independence and her athleticism. I mean, there's something like she's really not frail. Yeah, she doesn't have a voice that seduces you with its softness like Daisy does,
But it's really funny to read these essays from the 50s, which are quite brilliant. I mean, really because they established Gatsby as the book for America. But they can't handle her quite as a character. Even their terminology for her, she's a bit suspect to them.
Yeah. There's an interesting twist in the whole novel that Nick, briefly has a girlfriend, and has to negotiate that while he's negotiating this larger drama.
Well, it's funny, when my kids read it in high school, my daughter said, "Oh yeah, but Nick's kind of gay," and I said, "What?" And the end of the party, where he ends up really drunk and the photographer is downstairs and he's kind of in bed in his underwear, and then it trails off. And I thought, what's nice about the book, it gets reread for every generation.
Right. Well, there's that mysterious ellipsis there in
Yes.
at the end of chapter 2, where all of a sudden he's sitting up in bed in his underwear. Yeah.
And then the next thing he knows, he's sitting at 4 o'clock at the train station waiting for
Right. Right.
to arrive.
Right. Right. And he has described Mr. McKee as a pale feminine man. So.
So, John, I really want to thank you, and I know we're still in sort of quarantine conditions. Is Gatz going to be on stage? So, elevator repair services production.
Well, I've learned to stop saying it's over, because I keep thinking it is. We were very lucky to be performing it in Berkeley at Berkeley Rep. Just days before everything shut down. We flew back home from California on March 1st after a good long run there. I think a 5-week run. So I don't know. I mean, we're all so much older than we were when we first put this thing together. And, it seems with greater absurdity, these actors play people who are in their 30s, but they can still do it. So if somebody wants it, I think we'll still be willing to do it.
That's great. We would love that. I thought you were going to say we're all so much older than on March 1st, and now it's November.
Because we are also older than that.
Older, right? So I really want to thank you, and I have to say, your take on the book is one of the most inspiring ones, and I love the fact that you were inspired to try something that risked failure. And I wish you the best of luck for the next few months, and I know you have a newborn son, so enjoy those restless.
I will. Thank you.
All right. Thanks
for having me. All right. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.
All right.
Think about it. Deep conversations with Uli Baer on big ideas and great books.